In the village of Kenron, home to people famous for their extraordinary strength, there was a young boy who had barely sprouted his first feathers, so to speak. At his age, other kids were already punching dinosaurs to death. Yet this boy couldn't even catch a single small rabbit. Worse still, he got kicked square in the face by it, hard enough to rattle his teeth, followed by a relentless string of scratches. By the time he got back up, the rabbit had already run off, and just as disappointment started to set in, he heard his older brother calling out to him, holding none other than the very rabbit that had escaped. Seeing Shoma come home, Lloyd was overjoyed. His brother had left the village long ago to travel and explore the world, and every time he returned, Shoma brought back fascinating stories. Because of this, the outside world had always seemed genuinely worth exploring in Lloyd's mind, and he wanted to venture out just like his brother had. In the blink of an eye, several years passed, and Lloyd, once a boy without even his first feathers, could now fly. He also managed to achieve what he'd always wanted, leaving the village of Kenron behind to explore the world. Lloyd made his way to the home of a witch and hesitantly asked if she was Marie. She confirmed it was indeed her, then told him that if he wanted the witch to grant his wish, he'd have to pay a fitting price. Seeing her serious expression, he told her he was looking for a place to rent. Marie immediately exploded, ranting that she was an all-powerful witch, not some real estate agent. So why was he even asking her that? Just as she was about to unleash a proper scolding, Lloyd mentioned he was from the village of Kenron, and then dropped the name of the village chief, Alka. The moment he finished speaking, he pulled out a glass orb, and from within it emerged the image of a tiny, petite woman. Marie, who moments ago had been all fangs and fury, dropped to her knees before she even realized what she was doing, because that woman was Alka, her own master. Alka got straight to the point. Lloyd was a child deeply beloved by everyone, so Marie needed to take excellent care of him. If anything happened to Lloyd, Marie could go outside and start getting used to the smell of dirt, so there'd be no surprises when she ended up 6 feet under later. Marie swore she would look after Lloyd wholeheartedly, so Alka had nothing to worry about. Just as Marie was about to ask Alka a few things, she was told this was merely a recorded image. Having held her tongue this whole time, Marie finally stood up and let loose a torrent of curses. That's when Alka said she'd just been joking, that this was actually her real, present consciousness, and Marie dropped back to her knees in fear. Alka didn't even bother scolding her for it and simply left. The moment her master vanished, Marie flipped her attitude faster than turning a page, snatching up the orb and winding up with a pitching stance sharper than any professional athlete's, hurling it straight into the cabinet, all while spewing a non-stop stream of curses at that damned old hag, kicking the cabinet shut with her foot for good measure. Watching this unfold, Lloyd began to worry about what his days ahead might look like. Fortunately, the moment Marie turned back to face him, her entire demeanor shifted completely. She even seemed to form a fairly good impression of Lloyd, figuring that even someone tangled up with that old hag could still turn out to be a decent person. No sooner had Marie finished her little musing than Alka stepped right back out of the cabinet. She had teleported herself there directly just to check on Lloyd's situation with her own eyes for peace of mind, and happened to catch her wretched disciple cursing her out exactly like that. Before Alka left, she cast a curse of misfortune upon Marie, one etched in ancient runes. Marie nearly lost her mind hearing this. Runes were a language that, if mastered, could destroy the entire world, and yet this old hag had used it to curse her own disciple. Marie was mid-rant, cursing that when Alka grew old she'd have nothing to drink but plain water, no milk for her. The instant she finished saying that, she found herself hit with one misfortune after another. The next morning, Marie had stayed up the entire night trying to break the curse and had fallen asleep slumped over her desk. Lloyd, without her noticing, had already finished cooking breakfast and brought it to her. Marie was genuinely touched by this kindness, and thanks to it, the two finally had a chance to talk. Lloyd explained that because he admired someone so much, he wanted to have experiences similar to theirs, and that was why he was heading to the city to enlist in the army. Word had it that the enlistment exam was brutal, covering everything from combat and spellcasting to real battlefield scenarios. Even though Lloyd was the weakest person in the village, he still wanted to give it a try. An ordinary person could travel from Kenron to the city in just 2 days, but Lloyd took a full 6. Marie thought 6 days was actually pretty fast if you were taking a train, since going by horse would take even longer. The moment she said that, Lloyd casually mentioned he'd run there on foot, no train involved. Marie, who had just taken a bite, genuinely felt like throwing up right on the spot. Seeing her reaction, Lloyd calmly added that his grandfather could make the same trip on foot in just 2 days. Along the way, Lloyd had encountered a few monsters, but since they were so weak, he mistook them for ordinary animals. In Lloyd's mind, only something on the level of a demon lord deserved to be called a monster. Marie heard this and sprayed her food all over her own face, and Lloyd, seeing that, calmly wiped it off for her. For some reason, right after that, Marie's face suddenly became noticeably smoother and clearer. When she asked why, she learned Lloyd had imbued runes into the cloth, and he even added that it was pretty basic stuff. Marie was so furious she nearly choked on her own blood. That particular spell could undo any curse, and it had taken her 3 full years of grueling training, starving herself and holding back who knows what, just to master it. Marie wanted to smash her head into the wall and die just to escape this miserable existence, but since she couldn't actually die, she was left with no choice but to helplessly live alongside the human-shaped monster known as Lloyd. The next day, in a narrow alley, a young woman was walking along when she ran into a giant grasshopper monster. Though she managed to dodge its lunging strikes in time, the moment it leapt up, the gust from its wings sent her crashing straight into a house, just as she was about to end up on an altar, prepped for her own funeral. Lloyd came diving down from the sky and crushed it flat with a single stomp, then flung the monster's body into the air as casually as tossing a pebble. Even though he had somewhere to be, Lloyd still didn't forget to check on the young woman and ask if she was all right, and only once he confirmed she was fine did he take off. Lloyd had no idea that through today's actions, he'd just picked up a wife, so to speak. What's more, she happened to be strikingly beautiful. Though because of a curse, she always had straps wrapped around her head covering more than half her face. The moment she met him happened to be the very moment she wanted those straps off more than ever before. She was ready to rip them off no matter what, even if it tore her face apart in the process. But to her surprise, the straps simply came undone on their own, gently and without resistance. The young woman stood there stunned, then recalled a prophecy, that one day, through the power of someone truly strong, the curse would be broken, and that person was none other than Lloyd. The following day, the army enlistment exam finally began. Colonel Murthohan looked over the promising candidates with satisfaction, among them Riho, a mercenary once wanted for having literally cooked her own employer alive. Though she was quite dangerous, being a mercenary meant that as long as she was paid the right price, she stuck to the rules. Riho, as strong as she was in Murthohan's eyes, took one look at Lloyd and nearly wet herself with fear on the spot, practically pissing blood. Her instincts screamed at her that this was a monster wearing a human skin, because there was no way any ordinary human could give off such a dangerously overwhelming presence. Just as Riho was about to slip away elsewhere, Lloyd called out to stop her. He'd taken quite a liking to her armored gauntlets and simply wanted to strike up a conversation and get acquainted. Unaware of this, Riho was tense to the extreme, and the moment she managed to introduce herself, Selin, the young woman Lloyd had saved the day before, came charging in and knocked her clean off to the side. Having just found Lloyd, Selin was ready to give Riho a beating, convinced she had designs on him. But once she learned the two had only just met, she let it go without a second thought. A little later, as the exam got underway, Riho asked Murthohan where on earth that monster of a boy had come from. He had no idea either, and honestly, he was just as curious about where this wandering weapon of war had sprung from. He desperately wanted to watch Lloyd take the exam, but he had other areas to monitor, so he had to let it go for now. A while later, once the exam concluded, everyone who had passed had gathered in the room. Riho and Selin scanned the place but couldn't find Lloyd anywhere. They were about to ask Murthohan when they noticed he too was glancing all around, searching for him without any luck. It was only when Colleen spoke up and told Murthohan to focus on his actual duties that he suddenly blurted out, asking if anyone who wasn't present could please speak up. Hearing her comrade utter something so mind-bogglingly absurd, Colleen immediately smacked him one good time. Once Murthohan finished handing out the information sheets to the new recruits, Colleen announced that relations between the Kingdom of Azami and the Ziyu Empire had been steadily deteriorating, and that war seemed all but unavoidable in the near future. Most recently, the incident troubling the entire kingdom was the disappearance of Princess Maria. The new recruits' first and most urgent mission was to locate the princess. Whoever found her could have practically anything they wanted from the kingdom. Grand estates, titles, ruling over an entire region, all of it was on the table. Hearing this, Selin's eyes lit up instantly. This was the perfect opportunity for Lloyd to become an officer without ever needing to pass the exam. Meanwhile, Lloyd was making his way back, thoroughly dejected, having found both the practical and theoretical portions of the exam far too difficult for his liking. As he walked along, he stopped in front of a job posting when a bug suddenly came flying at him. Lloyd simply flicked it away with one finger, sending it flying off into oblivion, before heading toward a nearby eatery, the very place that happened to be hiring. The moment Lloyd stepped inside, the man there attacked him, but Lloyd dodged the punch with unbelievably fast movement. He then explained he meant no harm and had only come because he wanted a job. The shop owner turned out to be Chrome, a former captain of the Royal Guard. Chrome wasn't foolish enough to believe for a second that someone radiating such an overwhelming, destructive aura had shown up just to work a part-time job. He suspected the person in front of him had come to pry information out of a former Royal Guard captain like himself. Even so, he asked Lloyd what skills he had that made him think he was fit to work at the restaurant. Lloyd answered plainly that he was excellent at cooking and cleaning. But Chrome heard something entirely different, that he was apparently very skilled at handling people and cleaning up crime scenes. And so Chrome braced himself, fully prepared for things to get bloody, and demanded Lloyd demonstrate his skills right then and there. Under his intensely serious gaze, Lloyd walked straight into the kitchen and cooked completely normally. Even watching Lloyd show no sign of anything unusual, Chrome remained on edge, wondering if he might suddenly strike without warning before he could even react. But no matter how long he waited, Chrome never saw Lloyd make a move, not until the dish was finally set down on the table. He was certain that the moment he took a bite, that's when Lloyd would strike, and so, sweating buckets from sheer nervous anticipation, Chrome put the food in his mouth and froze completely. It wasn't poisoned, it was simply unbelievably delicious. By the time he'd finished the entire plate, Chrome still found it hard to believe Lloyd had come here just to apply for a job. Still, he couldn't just let someone this dangerous wander freely around the city, so he decided to hire him, if only to keep him under close watch for now. Once the job hunting was done, Lloyd returned home to report that he'd failed the exam, leaving both Marie and Alka utterly stunned. Alka even threatened to blow up the entire kingdom. Marie panicked hearing that, though thankfully the old hag was only joking, even if the malice toward the kingdom was genuine. Alka had originally planned to bring Lloyd back to the village, but he told her he'd simply retake the exam next year. Lloyd had already found a job, and going forward, he'd pay Marie in full for his room and board. Alka mulled it over for a moment and eventually agreed. Once Lloyd made his intentions clear, he headed into the kitchen to cook. And just as Alka was about to bring in a bed to move in and live alongside him, Marie suddenly turned serious, asking her master to help the kingdom. For reasons unclear, the king had recently grown alarmingly aggressive, and on the upcoming day of the state summit, the empire would be sending a delegation of envoys. That could very well be the moment the two sides declared war on each other. Alka understood the kingdom had reached a critical point, but Qumran didn't exist to serve human pride or petty squabbles between people. They were a force meant solely to stand against threats to humanity's very survival, like demon lords or monsters. Not only did Alka refuse to help, she outright warned Marie never to drag Lloyd into this chaos. Otherwise, she'd take Lloyd back home immediately. On Murthahan's side, the group gathered to figure out exactly why Lloyd had failed the exam. They couldn't make sense of it until they looked at his theoretical exam, where his answers were nothing but a series of strange, cryptic drawings. At first, they assumed that's all it was, until Colleen took a closer look and realized, to her shock, that these were ancient runes. The examiner who graded the magic portion spoke up, recalling that Lloyd had said he could only cast spells on the level of something as simple as summoning rain. Riho had initially assumed he'd just been born in a bomb crater or something, prone to causing explosions and nothing more. But if runes were involved, that was an entirely different matter altogether. From that moment, Riho realized the army had just narrowly missed out on recruiting someone truly exceptional. They immediately launched a mission to track Lloyd down, determined to find him before war broke out. The next morning, Murthahan and Riho headed to Chrome's place for breakfast. At first, they didn't think much of it, but they soon noticed the familiar restaurant seemed oddly different. Not only were there more customers than usual, but the place was also spotlessly clean. Chrome's establishment was normally filthy, and his cooking was infamously so bad that even a dog would throw it right back up. No exaggeration could do justice to how bad it truly was. Yet today, everything felt strangely different. The moment they saw Lloyd step out from inside, Murthohan grabbed Chrome by the collar, demanding to know why on earth he was here. Chrome honestly had no clue either, and he was constantly on guard himself, terrified Lloyd might suddenly lunge and stab him without warning. While the two of them were arguing, Lloyd had gone outside to deal with the trash and spotted Marie hurrying off somewhere, looking rather urgent. Following behind her was a group of soldiers discussing something. Apparently a monster had appeared somewhere in the city. Curious about the monster himself, Lloyd decided to follow along. Right in the center of a plaza, a crowd had gathered because Selen was in the middle of an argument with Alan. While Selen had been out searching for Lloyd, someone had tried to take advantage of the moment to pull something shady. Little did he know, Selen turned out to be far tougher than expected and had plucked every last hair off his body in retaliation. Alan, whose mind didn't seem quite right to begin with, felt that her reaction was completely unreasonable, and from there, the conflict escalated. Alan suddenly pulled out an axe and charged straight at Selen, who, not having prepared herself in time, couldn't react fast enough. But right as the axe was about to come down, her strap suddenly whipped out on its own and knocked the axe clean away. Selen paid no mind to how strange that was and simply assumed it was Lloyd protecting her. And right at that very moment, he showed up, only further deepening the blind devotion already clouding Selen's mind. Murthohan's group arrived just then, and in order to test Lloyd's strength, Murthohan goaded Alan into fighting him. Riho felt something was clearly off about this, but Murthohan brushed it aside, saying that if Alan didn't offer up his head for Lloyd to punch, there was still a chance he could be saved. No sooner had he said that than Alan, standing right in front, genuinely offered his head up for Lloyd to punch. Everyone wanted to stop it, but it was too late. At the exact moment everyone assumed Alan was already as good as dead and ready for burial, a sudden whirlwind appeared out of nowhere, sweeping Lloyd away from the scene right before everyone's very eyes. There was no one else who could have done that but Marie. She'd been worried Lloyd might end up punching Alan to death and had stepped in to intervene. Lloyd, not quite grasping the situation, believed Alan to be an incredibly powerful fighter, and figured that if he'd actually gone through with the fight, he would have been the one getting buried instead. Because of this, Lloyd felt deeply grateful to Marie for saving him. She thought he was hopelessly naive and warned him he needed to be more careful, since being this innocent meant he'd get swindled out of his last pair of pants the moment some girl set her sights on him out there. Lloyd paid that no mind whatsoever. The only thing that mattered right now was that Marie had saved him, and because of that, he was determined to repay her kindness in every way he could. Seeing his sincere expression, and more importantly, his tall, handsome features, Marie immediately felt her heart flutter and had to fight back a nosebleed. Just as the two of them were enjoying a pleasant conversation, Chrome's voice suddenly carried up from below. The moment she saw him, Marie's expression turned serious, and she told Lloyd to head back on his own so the two of them could stay behind and talk for a bit. As it turned out, Marie was actually Maria, the very princess who had gone missing without a trace. Back then, Chrome had been the princess's closest personal attendant, and blaming himself for what happened, he'd resigned from his position and returned to an ordinary life as the owner of a small restaurant. The reason Maria had left in the first place was to find a way to save her father. Under normal circumstances, the king had never been a warmongering man. Someone undergoing such a drastic personality shift in such a short span of time was deeply unusual, and Maria suspected her father had been cursed, believing that since no one else could save him, she'd have to take matters into her own hands. Maria told Chrome that the situation had now become truly urgent, and that the day the festival took place would be the moment she finally made her move. Meanwhile, Selen was feeling down after having just reunited with Lloyd, only to be separated from him again before she'd even had the chance to do anything. Riho told her that didn't matter right now. What mattered was finding the princess, otherwise Lloyd would have no way of becoming an actual soldier. And so, Riho made her way to an incredibly famous location, the home of the all-powerful witch, Marie. The moment they stepped inside, Selen spotted Lloyd and was overjoyed, never imagining this was actually where he lived. Watching this, Riho was genuinely at a loss for words. Here was this girl running around claiming to be someone's wife and whatnot, yet she didn't even know where he lived. This one seemed to be in the terminal stages of some kind of delusional disorder. Only pesticide could save her at this point. Right then, Marie returned from outside, looking utterly lazy and worn out, and asked Lloyd to prepare some beer and snacks for her. The moment she flopped down onto the couch, She noticed there were guests in the house and immediately snapped back into her usual cold, ice-cold demeanor. Seeing another woman in the house, Selen's face darkened as though someone had eaten all her food without asking. Riho, paying no attention to any of that, pulled out a photo of the princess as a young child. Marie, overwhelmed with nerves, blurted out that she wasn't going to provide any information about the princess whatsoever. That statement alone made her incredibly suspicious, since Riho had never actually said the person in the photo was the princess to begin with. On top of that, looking closely, Riho felt Marie bore a certain resemblance to the princess. Right at that moment, Selen spoke up and asked how long Marie had been living there. She answered that it had been 2 years. Hearing this, Selen's expression darkened, and she asked her an incredibly important question. Marie listened intently, bracing herself, convinced her true identity had just been exposed. Certain the girl must be furious that a member of the royal family, the princess herself, had abandoned her own country. But to her surprise, what Selen actually wanted to know was whether Marie happened to be Lloyd's wife. Riho, standing right there, was left completely speechless, wondering what on earth was going on inside this girl's head. Marie explained that their relationship was more like that of family, distant relatives of sorts. Right at that moment, Lloyd also walked outside, announcing with an incredibly serious expression that he had discovered her true identity. Everyone tensed up once again, only to be met with disappointment when Lloyd revealed that Marie was, in fact, a hero. From secretly wiping out monsters to protecting him. If someone doing all of that wasn't a hero, then who else could possibly be? Marie felt that being mistaken for a hero was, frankly, a far better outcome than having her true identity discovered. Lloyd immediately grew excited, wanting to lend his strength to help her protect the kingdom. Hearing this, Marie snapped at him that it was out of the question. Having the determination alone didn't mean he could just accomplish anything he set his mind to. Though Lloyd was genuinely shocked hearing those words, Marie refused to budge and remained firm in stopping him from getting involved in the kingdom's affairs. It wasn't until Lloyd, thoroughly disappointed, walked off into his room that Marie finally explained to the other two that he was a resident of the village of Kenran, before finally confessing her own true identity as well. Marie explained that acting rashly right now wasn't exactly convenient, since the one instigating the war was also actively searching for her, and she asked Selen and Riho to investigate that person first. Selen and Riho agreed without hesitation, and after searching all over the city, they managed to catch a man who kept asking around about the princess's whereabouts. He had no idea who was really pulling the strings behind the scenes, only that every time this mysterious figure appeared, he always said the same thing: for the peace of the kingdom. That afternoon, as Marie reassured herself that everything was almost settled, that she'd mastered the runes and could finally save her father, Alka suddenly appeared, completely drenched from head to toe. As it turned out, the last time Marie had called Alka an old hag, she'd ended up cursed with misfortune in return, and to vent her frustration, Marie had thrown the orb straight down a well. That was exactly why Alka had ended up soaking wet the moment she teleported over. Alka didn't bother scolding Marie for it either. The most important thing right now was to go comfort Lloyd, who was probably feeling quite down at the moment. Before leaving, Alka cast a curse on Marie that made her let out a little meow every single time she spoke. That night, Alka and Lloyd went out for a walk through the city. With the festival preparations underway, the city was noticeably more lively than usual, and what was supposed to be an ordinary evening stroll took a turn when a monster suddenly appeared. At that very moment, Chrome had gone to meet with the king to request his reinstatement, and the king responded with a strangely eerie silence. Chrome turned to look at Murthohan with an oddly suspicious expression. According to the investigation, the person orchestrating the war always uttered the exact same phrase, "for the peace of the kingdom." Within the current administration, the only person who consistently said that particular phrase was Murthohan. Once exposed, Murthohan didn't even bother hiding it. The king was simply too weak, allowing the empire to run rampant unchecked. If things kept going this way, wouldn't it be far better to just become a puppet instead? Right at that moment, Marie and the other two arrived on the scene. The king suddenly turned around and, without warning, sent Murthohan flying with a single blow. Strange markings had appeared across the king's face. His eyes had turned completely black, with irises as red and vivid as fresh blood. The king wasn't actually being controlled by Murthohan at all, but by an entirely different entity, one that had deliberately gone along with him purely to stir up chaos, all to make it easier to carry out its own plan. Having said that, the entity grabbed hold of Murthohan's head, and a strange fluid began oozing from its palm, transforming Murthohan's very form, no longer human, but a monster. After that, it took its leave, and while Selen and Riho stayed behind to confront the transformed Murthohan, Marie chased after the king. The two of them made their way to the audience hall, where Marie, without hesitation, launched a direct attack straight at him. But before her whirlwind could even reach him, it was blocked by some kind of shield. Undeterred, Marie kept up her assault, weaving her attacks together to create a screen of mist that obscured her opponent's vision. Taking advantage of the cover, she closed in and unleashed the ancient purification rune. And just as she was on the verge of succeeding, the entity disguised itself as the king to throw her off balance. Her one and only chance at victory slipped right through her fingers in that instant. Marie was struck down, and the entity arrogantly hoisted her up like a chicken and snapped her arm. Everyone assumed Marie would surrender at this point, but she didn't. As a member of the royal family, she had a duty to fight until her very last breath. Hearing this, the entity controlling the king burst into laughter, and in a fit of exhilaration, he roared that no matter how Marie chose to resist, this entire world would fall into his hands regardless, for he was none other than the demon lord Abaddon. Hearing this, Marie froze in place, utterly stunned. Switching over to Lloyd, he had already cleared out an entire swarm of monsters using a method no one could have anticipated, curling his fingers back and flicking them forward, not striking the monsters directly, but instead using the gust of wind generated to blow them all away. Once he'd dealt with the whole swarm, Lloyd sighed, remarking that he'd heard from the townspeople that all sorts of terrifying monsters had been showing up everywhere. Yet all he'd run into so far were these pathetic little insects that barely even deserved mention. This wasn't really Lloyd's fault though. Having never truly experienced the world, there was no way he could have known these were, in fact, monsters, and Alka standing beside him found it a bit awkward to explain otherwise. Once things were settled here, Lloyd looked off toward the castle and said he really wanted to head over there. Alka asked if he even knew what he'd do once he got there, and Lloyd bluntly answered that he had no idea. She was left completely speechless hearing that, but Lloyd understood that Marie might be in danger. He was fully aware that showing up there might upset her, but even so, Lloyd still wanted to do his part in protecting the kingdom. That was simply what a soldier was meant to do, and if Lloyd truly wanted to become one himself, he couldn't just stand by and watch. With that said, Lloyd made his way toward the royal palace. Along the way, he came across Alan hiding in a corner somewhere. Caught in the act, Alan initially tried to insist he wasn't afraid and definitely wasn't hiding from anything. But in the end, Alan bravely admitted that he was, in fact, terrified. Lloyd didn't mock him or tease him for it. Instead, he recalled the very first time he himself had faced off against a monster, or more accurately, even a demon lord couldn't escape feeling that same fear. Lloyd encouraged Alan to simply stand back up and pick up his weapon, telling him all he needed to do was remember why he'd wanted to become a soldier in the first place. Right at that moment, another monster showed up, and since Lloyd didn't exactly have time to spare mid-conversation, he took care of it in an instant before continuing on his way. It was precisely because he'd witnessed Lloyd dispatch a monster so effortlessly that Alan later managed to regain his confidence. When he ran into a swarm of giant insects, he wasn't afraid in the slightest and cut one down with a single strike. The moment Alan finished dealing with it, he noticed an enormous magic circle forming in the sky above. The one responsible for creating it was Alka. After taking a closer look at the insects, she'd suddenly remembered they were, in fact, Abaddon's minions. Unwilling to simply stand by any longer, Alka shot up into the sky and cast a spell, raining down hailstones to crush every last monster below. Back inside the castle, Abaddon, seeing Marie standing completely still, couldn't quite make sense of it, wondering if she was simply too terrified to move. Marie then completely exploded, demanding to know why he hadn't just said he was the demon lord from the very start. Wouldn't things have gone so much smoother if he had? Marie was genuinely furious to the point of losing her mind, and after stomping around venting her frustration, she said nothing further and simply took off running. Abaddon, utterly baffled by what was happening, was determined to chase after her regardless. Meanwhile, on Chrome's side, they were locked in battle against Murthohan, though calling it a battle was generous, considering Chrome and Riho weren't landing a single hit on him. Murthohan had already possessed exceptional combat skills to begin with, and now, wielding the unimaginable power of a demon, there was simply no way they could match him. Riho told Selen to go find Lloyd, or they were all going to end up dead. Seeing Selen spring into action, Chrome and Riho both figured Lloyd would be arriving shortly. Little did they expect, however, that she'd actually offer up her own head for Murthohan to hit, convinced that the invisible thread of love between them would somehow summon him even faster. Watching this unfold, Riho's jaw twitched uncontrollably. She genuinely wanted to file a report with the WHO about a documented case of someone well over 10 years old whose brain apparently never left the womb, because no sane, normal person could possibly be this foolish. But against all odds, the moment Murthohan lunged forward to strike Selen, her strap once again sprang into action on its own, not only blocking his very first attack, but also proving completely impenetrable against every single furious punch he threw afterward. Riho was quite taken aback by this, but she still didn't forget her task and headed off to find Lloyd. The instant she stepped outside, Murthohan was sent crashing to the ground by another blow from the strap, and at that exact same moment, Lloyd came running up to the castle gates. He walked inside and immediately noticed everyone seemed to be in rough shape, especially Murthohan, who had clearly lost all sense of reason and was attacking his own allies. Lloyd struck Murthohan down with a single slap, then asked him, point blank, what exactly he'd enlisted for in the first place. Wasn't it originally for the sake of peace in the kingdom? To protect the pure, genuine smiles of its people? For some reason, Lloyd's words managed to strike something deep within Murthohan, causing him to pause, and the demonic armor covering his body began showing the first signs of cracking. Just as Murthohan seemed on the verge of coming back to his senses, Lloyd added that everyone must have overindulged at the festivities, getting so drunk that they'd lost all composure and started fighting each other, and that simply wouldn't do. The instant Murthohan heard that remark, he transformed once more and lunged straight at Lloyd, who leaned back before snapping forward and headbutting him square in the head, sending Murthohan flying quite a considerable distance. Watching this unfold, everyone assumed Murthohan had surely died on the spot, with nothing left to save at this point. Right then, Marie came running up, and just as Lloyd braced himself, expecting her to scold him, she instead rushed forward and joyfully wrapped him in a hug. Abaddon, still hot on her heels, came charging in right behind her, and the moment he caught his breath, Lloyd was already right there in front of him. Lloyd had no idea this was actually the Demon Lord. He simply assumed some older man had gone way overboard, dressing up as the king and scribbling all sorts of nonsensical markings across his own body. Marie didn't bother explaining anything and instead made up a story on the spot, claiming she was a hero who just finished fighting off monsters. She then added that, utterly exhausted, she'd run into this strange man who seemed to be in some kind of trouble and needed help, asking Lloyd to take his cloth and wipe the man down. Following her instructions, Lloyd pulled out the cloth inscribed with ancient runes, and though the Demon Lord, well aware this could erase his very existence from the world entirely, tried to fight back, the outcome remained unchanged. The markings proving his identity as the Demon Lord were gradually wiped away, and along with them, his entire presence vanished from existence altogether. Following the chaos of the previous day, the royal capital had finally returned to its usual, ordinary rhythm. As Lloyd walked through the streets, he happened to run into his brother, Shoma, once again. Except before they could exchange more than a few words, Shoma's expression suddenly shifted, and he walked off without another word. At the same time, Alka came rushing over with ice cream in hand, asking Lloyd if he'd felt lonely or missed her while she'd been away. Truly, there were no words left to describe it. After returning to Maria's home, Lloyd finally put on his military uniform. The moment he stepped outside, Selen and Riho came running up as well. What started out as a simple attempt to greet Lloyd gradually escalated into a full-blown battle between Selen and Alka, both fighting over him. Though Selen wasn't nearly as strong as Alka, she had absolutely no intention of backing down in this fight for her future husband. Shortly after, Alan showed up too, and following what had happened earlier, he'd become utterly devoted to worshipping Lloyd without end. Naturally, his arrival only added to the chaos already unfolding on the scene. Marie, thoroughly annoyed by the entire spectacle, kicked her master out of the house, then chased Lloyd's whole group off to school so she could finally reclaim some peace and quiet for herself. One day, Marie suddenly dragged Lloyd and Chrome along to a village called Holy Sword. There was a rather special sword there, one that no one could pull free unless they possessed an unimaginably vast amount of magical power. Marie didn't mention that the real purpose of the trip was to pull the sword out. She simply told Lloyd there was some trash that needed cleaning up in the area, and that among it happened to be the holy sword itself. Despite the nearby shop owner cursing them out, hoping to profit off the sword himself, Lloyd went about picking up the trash without a care in the world. The moment he reached out and grabbed the sword, he pulled it free right in front of everyone, as effortlessly as pushing a shopping cart through a supermarket, with absolutely no resistance or difficulty whatsoever. The shop owner watched this and burst into tears far heavier than any rainstorm. His plan to strike it rich without lifting a finger, living off the sword for 3 generations, had just gone completely bankrupt. Watching this unfold, Marie considered reporting him to her superiors, worried he might try passing off a fake holy sword to lure in tourists next. Even after such a long trip, Lloyd still showed up the next morning fully prepared for training as usual. What's more, unlike everyone else in class who was completely exhausted and half dead, Lloyd carried on as though he hadn't felt a thing. Truly, a monster through and through. While everyone was waiting for the next class to begin, Colleen walked in from outside to announce some important news. The combat training class would be postponed, and in its place, everyone would be learning magic instead, in preparation for the upcoming exchange match against Rock Academy. There were 3 different methods for casting magic: chanting incantations, relying on magic stones, or engraving specific runes to activate spells. Depending on each person's circumstances and combat style, they could choose whichever method suited them best. Once she finished explaining, Colleen had everyone practice casting spells against stone statues enchanted to resist magic. Everything went smoothly enough until Lloyd took his turn. His incantation came out slightly off, yet the orb he launched didn't just shatter the practice statue entirely. It also blew apart a portion of the academy itself. The other spells Lloyd attempted fared no better. Watching the destruction he'd caused, Colleen bitterly decided to keep Lloyd confined indoors from then on. Letting him out into the field would only mean more business for the funeral home and the marching band that played at burials. After training wrapped up, Selin suddenly proposed she wanted to learn Colleen's healing magic. Colleen was quite surprised, since this was widely known as the most difficult branch of magic to master. Selin couldn't care less about that. All she needed to know was whether it could make Lloyd happy. And so, not just Selin, but Riho too began showing interest. Learning healing magic required someone injured to practice on, and as luck would have it, or rather, sheer misfortune, Alan happened to show up at exactly the moment the group needed a punching bag, and so Alan ended up thoroughly beaten and bruised so the rest of them could practice their healing spells. Meanwhile, over at Marie's place, she had 2 visitors drop by that day. It was the notorious duo from Rock Academy, and they'd brought along a photo of Riho, wanting information about her. Before Marie could even respond, Philo and Mina suddenly grew on edge, sensing an overwhelming pressure radiating from outside. The moment the door opened, Philo didn't hesitate to unleash 2 devastating kicks meant to eliminate the threat entirely. But the person on the receiving end, Lloyd, remained completely unfazed. He'd simply noticed a fly buzzing past and assumed she'd been trying to swat it. And since he hadn't managed to dodge in time, he only thought to apologize. Philo, on the other hand, wasn't thinking anything nearly that complicated. All she knew was that anyone who could take her strike head-on without a scratch had to be incredibly powerful. Philo immediately begged Lloyd to accept her as his disciple, wanting to live alongside him so she could learn from him directly. Lloyd had no idea how to respond, so he simply passed the matter over to Marie, who wasted not even a second before tossing both of them straight out the door. She wasn't crazy enough to let yet another rival move in and compete for Lloyd's attention. The moment that matter with Philo was settled, Alka arrived. Having heard that Marie had taken Lloyd on a romantic little getaway to the Sword Village, she promptly transformed Marie into a butterfly, then proceeded to enjoy a meal alongside Lloyd as though nothing at all had happened. It wasn't until evening that Marie finally turned back into her human form, completely stark naked, and it was right at that exact moment that Lloyd walked in. He stared for a moment, then, without a word, simply turned around and walked back out. Marie hurriedly got dressed, then lay back down in her usual spot, pretending to be fast asleep and oblivious to everything, just to spare herself the embarrassment. The next morning, though the exchange match hadn't even taken place yet, the group from Rock Academy of Magic had already arrived. Leading them was Roll, a woman Colleen absolutely despised. This woman was more twisted and treacherous than a cosmic black hole, having pulled every dirty trick imaginable just to claw her way into the position of Academy Director. On top of that, she happened to know Riho personally and had threatened that if Riho didn't come back, Roll would do something that would make her deeply regret it. Ever since that day, Riho hadn't been herself, spending her days consumed by gloom. Lloyd noticed this and grew concerned, and Selen, following his lead, kept a watchful eye on the situation as well, her gaze turning noticeably dangerous. Not knowing how to cheer Riho up, Lloyd went to ask Marie for advice. She assumed Lloyd wanted to make her happy and suggested a date, only to realize her mistake once she learned he actually wanted to comfort Riho instead.
Lloyd showed up at school without hesitation and asked Riho out.
Then directly asked her about whatever was troubling her. Riho didn't dance around the subject either, and told him she and Roll had first met at an orphanage. Their relationship had started out wonderfully, until one day Roll returned with a mechanical arm meant to treat Riho's disabled left arm. Riho had assumed things would finally start looking up from there, but Roll's intentions weren't nearly as pure as they seemed. The arm had actually been designed to drain magical power from its wearer and funnel it into Roll's own reserves. Roll wanted to use it to pull out the holy sword herself. Selen, secretly listening in from outside, was deeply moved hearing this whole story unfold. Never would she have imagined Riho had such a rotten, backstabbing friend. Truly, when picking mangoes, avoid the sour ones, and when picking friends, avoid the ones who'd pick the sour mango and hand it to you. Sometime later, in preparation for the upcoming exchange match, both sides arranged a practice bout beforehand. Right at this moment, Makona, another remarkably talented second-year student, made her appearance. She requested to fight in Lloyd's place, wanting to prove she was stronger than him. It sounded impressive enough, her entrance cooler than anything imaginable. Yet the moment she squared off against Philo, a single strike sent her flying instantly. Talk big and get knocked flat. Some people really do have a talent for it. Before long, the day both sides would officially clash in front of a crowd of thousands finally arrived. Riho told Roll plainly that she had no intention of coming back, and that she'd protect the orphanage in her own way instead. Right as tensions were mounting between them, Chrome stepped forward to announce that, beyond the prize money, whoever won today's competition would also get to touch the holy sword. This announcement left both Riho and Roll utterly stunned. Riho grabbed Chrome by the collar and shook him repeatedly, demanding to know why he hadn't mentioned the holy sword from the very beginning. He had no answer either, insisting there was no way he could have known she needed it that badly. Roll's side, meanwhile, turned considerably more ruthless, throwing herself into the match purely to claim the sword, resorting to every underhanded scheme imaginable, crossing every line of decency without a shred of restraint. Even Colleen felt uneasy about sending Lloyd into battle at this point. The first match was a showdown between Philo and Selen. Selen, as confident as ever, believed that with her cursed strap protecting her, absolutely no one could touch her. That confidence, however, quickly turned into a desperate scramble to flee once Philo unleashed an attack that the strap didn't so much as twitch in response to. As she ran, Selen cursed loudly at the thing, demanding to know what on earth was wrong with it. Why it worked sometimes and not other times. She demanded to know its exact rules once and for all, insisting it stop staying so infuriatingly silent about it. No matter how much she pleaded, the strap gave no response whatsoever. And right at that moment, Philo cast a spell that looked even more dangerous than the last. Selen threatened the strap, warning that if it didn't start doing its job properly, she'd use it to wipe her butt from now on. Strangely enough, that threat actually worked. The strap spun into motion, intercepting a bolt of lightning descending from above. Not only that, but every other attack that followed couldn't get anywhere near Selen either. When the strap counterattacked, it bound Philo so tightly she couldn't move even an inch. Even so, the one declared the loser of this match was Selen herself. This was a magic exchange match, meaning all forms of physical attacks were strictly forbidden, and so Selen was disqualified, making Philo the winner of this round. The second match pitted Mina against Lloyd. The moment Mina stepped onto the field, she cast a water-based spell that engulfed Lloyd's entire head, intending to cut off his oxygen supply until he either passed out or forfeited. But 5 minutes passed, then 10, then even 20, and nothing changed at all. Left with no other choice, Mina resorted to an even more terrifying spell, summoning an enormous pillar of water to trap Lloyd entirely before chanting an incantation meant to finish him off for good. To everyone's shock, from within that swirling vortex of water, Lloyd unleashed a spell of his own that sent Mina flying without any effort at all. That particular strike had actually come out weaker than intended, since Lloyd had slightly slurred a word in his incantation. Had he pronounced it correctly, Mina likely would have ended up 6 feet under by the following year. The final match was a showdown between two former friends, Riho and Roll. The moment the match began, both of them immediately started hurling fireballs directly at each other's faces, each trying to overpower the other's magical reserves and force a retreat. Riho was the one who broke the deadlock first, stepping back to reassess, and everyone assumed the exchange of attacks would simply continue back and forth for a while longer. To everyone's surprise, however, Roll suddenly charged forward and, in an instant, ripped off her own mechanical arm entirely. Riho's entire body immediately felt drained of all strength, and she collapsed to her knees. Roll herself seemed genuinely surprised she was even capable of removing it. Had she known that was possible, she would have done it long ago. Watching the scene unfold, Roll was convinced victory was already hers. To her shock, Riho suddenly sprang back up and landed a punch square across Roll's face, a punch carrying a magic circle that detonated on impact and sent Roll staggering backward. Roll was utterly stunned by the attack. Riho had secretly hidden a magic stone within her own arm and activated it through a method no one could have possibly predicted, then used healing magic to restore her arm afterward. Taking advantage of Roll's injured and terrified state, Riho immediately began chanting an incantation for an advanced level spell. Seeing what looked like another devastating spell about to take form, Roll was so terrified she fainted right on the spot. Riho burst out laughing. There was no way she still had enough magic left to actually cast an advanced spell. She'd only meant to bluff a little, and yet Roll had already been scared senseless by just that alone. Even while unconscious, Roll still refused to accept defeat. She wanted to climb to a position far higher than this, somewhere that couldn't even be compared to her current standing. A voice deep within her mind kept reminding her that reaching such heights required obtaining the Holy Sword. And so, the moment she regained consciousness, she immediately sent someone to investigate who had managed to pull the Holy Sword free. All the information led straight to Marie's home, with one particularly important detail standing out. Marie was deeply protective of a certain child. And so, Roll dispatched Philo to go capture that person and bring them back. Over at Marie's place, she was currently on her knees, begging and pleading before the crystal orb. Earlier that morning, master and disciple had gotten into an argument, and Alka, without hesitation, had cursed her disciple with a bout of diarrhea every 10 minutes. And so, all morning long, Marie had done nothing but run to the bathroom over and over while begging for forgiveness. Right at that moment, her stomach cramped up again, and Marie rushed off in such a hurry that she accidentally knocked over the gift Lloyd had given her. Philo, seeing this, walked in, and being rather simple-minded, took one look at the glass orb, assumed it was something extremely fragile that needed protecting, and immediately took it back to Roll. When Lloyd walked into the house carrying the Holy Sword, he found the place in complete disarray, with the gift he'd given Marie and a letter lying on the floor. The letter clearly stated that an important person had been taken, and that if he wanted to save them, he'd need to bring the Holy Sword to the designated meeting place. Alan arrived just then, and Lloyd, mistakenly believing Marie had been kidnapped, headed straight for the lighthouse with Alan to rescue her. At the lighthouse, Roll was busy berating herself for ever trusting Philo with such a task. But as it turned out, things had worked out rather well after all, since looking outside, she could see Lloyd already rushing over. No longer worried about anything else, Philo leapt down to block his path, eager for a real showdown with Lloyd. Lloyd initially had no intention of fighting, but Philo's attacks were genuinely dangerous. A relentless barrage of lightning-fast punches combined with kicks heavy enough to crush stone, forcing Lloyd to engage in combat whether he wanted to or not. Instead of actually fighting, though, Lloyd suddenly remembered a game from his hometown, arm wrestling, and suggested they settle things that way instead. Philo had no objections and agreed readily. The moment their arms locked together, a massive gust of wind erupted out of nowhere, as fierce as an actual storm, powerful enough to force Alan to duck into a nearby alley just to avoid getting caught in it. Right at that moment, one of Roll's men showed up, intent on stealing the sword. He unleashed a relentless barrage of fireballs, leaving Alan utterly unsure how to defend himself. Fortunately, at the most critical moment, Mina appeared and swiftly subdued the attacker, explaining that she wasn't after the Holy Sword at all. She'd only come to stop Roll's plan from succeeding, since Roll had always treated her and her sister, Philo, as mere tools rather than actual people. Back at Lloyd's fight, the standoff had grown so intense that both fighters had been lifted clean off the ground into the sky. Just as Lloyd's arm was gradually being forced down by Philo's strength, He unleashed a powerful wind-based spell, using its force to push himself back upright. But because of that very spell, the two of them ended up plummeting straight back down to the ground below. Things had certainly gotten far more out of hand than anyone had originally intended, though thankfully, Lloyd still emerged victorious in the end. At this point, he asked where Marie actually was. Philo admitted honestly that she hadn't captured anyone and recounted everything that had happened. It was only then that Lloyd realized he'd apparently misunderstood the entire situation. Right at that exact moment, a massive explosion erupted at the lighthouse. Needless to say, Alka had clearly arrived, and Roll, oblivious to just how dangerous provoking her could be, had managed to send her into a full-blown rage, and what was bound to happen simply happened. Roll ended up hospitalized after taking a single hit, though thankfully, she was still alive. Reflecting on everything now, she genuinely couldn't pinpoint exactly where things had gone so wrong. All she'd originally wanted was to rebuild the orphanage together with Riho. So how on earth had things spiraled this far out of control? By the time Roll finally came back to her senses, she found Riho there, peeling an apple for her, before quietly walking away. Before long, summer vacation finally arrived. It was a fairly long break, so everyone had all sorts of plans in mind. Riho, having earned quite a bit of money from the recent exchange match, wanted to ask Lloyd if he had somewhere in mind he wanted to go. Suddenly, the atmosphere turned noticeably cold, as Selin came trudging over from behind, radiating gloom. When asked, she explained she'd planned to spend the summer swimming and having fun, hoping to seal the deal and finally bring Lloyd home with her, only for her father to insist she come home no matter what. Selin didn't care in the slightest what the reason was or how important it might be. As far as she was concerned, nothing mattered more than spending time with Lloyd, and she was already quietly plotting to burn the house down. If there was no house left standing, there'd be no reason to go back at all. Had her father heard that thought, he surely would have coughed up blood and dropped dead on the spot, wondering why he'd even bothered raising a daughter this devoted to some boy. And that wasn't even the end of it. Alan also chimed in during this conversation in an incredibly theatrical way, claiming out loud that he was in quite a difficult position and didn't know what to do, all while his face utterly failed to hide his own delight. As it turned out, his father back home had called him in for a matchmaking meeting, and though Alan insisted he didn't want to go, his expression was practically glowing brighter than fresh vegetables just picked from the garden. Selin and Riho initially assumed he genuinely had a real problem on his hands, but the moment they realized he was just fishing for attention, they immediately dragged Lloyd out of the classroom without a second thought. The moment Lloyd got home, he found Marie and Alka in the middle of a fight. The two of them couldn't agree on how Lloyd should spend his summer vacation, so they'd resorted to settling it with an all-out brawl. And so Lloyd simply announced that he'd be working a live-in job for the entire break instead. Both of them initially objected, but seeing how genuinely interested he was in the idea, they reluctantly agreed. Marie planned on visiting the hotel where Lloyd would be working, treating it as a little getaway, and Alka wanted to tag along and see the place for herself too. That wonderful little plan, however, was immediately shut down by Lloyd, who explained he didn't want either of them showing up there, since he wanted to gradually learn to be independent instead of constantly relying on Marie and Alka for everything. Though Lloyd's words stung a little, there wasn't much either of them could do about it. At the hotel, the manager was waiting for the new employee Chrome had recommended when he suddenly sensed an overwhelmingly intense pressure. That, of course, was Lloyd, and thankfully he managed to introduce himself in time. Otherwise Koba would have assumed some old enemy had finally come to track him down. Koba had also served in the military once, which meant the two of them got along quite well right from the start. The hotel itself was fairly large, having gained popularity purely through luck at first, before gradually building a reputation and becoming a beloved resort destination for many. As he spoke, Koba led Lloyd to the open-air bathhouse, where Kikyo, a long-time employee, could be found. She was rather lazy and currently hiding from her duties. Had Koba not shown up, she might have simply fallen asleep right there. After scolding her briefly, Koba handed Lloyd over to Kikyo's supervision. Without saying much, Kikyo assigned him the task of cleaning every last corner of the bathhouse. While Kikyo was busy trying to psychologically manipulate Lloyd with her words, he had already gone ahead and cleaned the entire bathhouse until it sparkled. Seeing Kikyo's expression of pure disbelief, one easily mistaken for displeasure, Lloyd assumed she wasn't satisfied with his work, and so he went ahead and wiped down the ceiling as well. Before Kikyo could even say anything in response, Koba returned, and upon seeing the entire room gleaming like some divine sanctuary, he was thoroughly pleased. Naturally, someone Chrome had personally recommended had to be a cut above the rest. Koba pulled Lloyd aside, had him change into a proper uniform, and led him to a particular room. The hotel had recently welcomed an especially difficult noble guest, one so demanding and hard to please that even a seasoned hotel veteran like Koba dreaded every encounter with him. Just as Koba had warned, the moment Lord Thurionen saw him, he immediately started complaining loudly, insisting Koba clearly had no interest in properly welcoming him. When his attendant beside him tried pouring wine to placate him, Thurionen snapped at her too, telling her not to bother with such flattery. The attendant didn't dare say another word and simply withdrew. Yet the moment Lloyd spoke up, Thurionen's mood shifted entirely to satisfaction. There was a forest visible from his room that he found absolutely delightful, and while everyone present nodded along in agreement the moment he mentioned it, no one actually understood what exactly made it so beautiful or in what way. Only Lloyd seemed to genuinely understand how carefully the forest had been maintained and trimmed, and hearing this, Thurionen felt truly understood, which brought him considerable joy. That night, Thurionen dropped the pretense of simply being on a leisurely retreat, and Kikyo happened to be present as well. This time, his true purpose for coming was to investigate some strange incidents plaguing the hotel. There had been a series of bizarre unconsciousness cases recently, and even Koba, a former military man himself, hadn't been able to get to the bottom of it. According to the information Thurionen had gathered, someone had been cultivating Trent, an incredibly bizarre type of plant, to sell on the black market. This substance could infiltrate the human body and enhance it to an unimaginable degree. On top of that, Thurionen had also learned that a demon lord in seed form had recently gone missing, and that a mysterious merchant had brought the very same substance to this location. Thurionen's true reason for coming to this particular hotel, despite the cover story about arranging a matchmaking meeting for his son, was actually to investigate the mystery lurking beneath the surface. Hearing all this, Kikyo immediately thought of Lloyd, a young man possessing unbelievable strength. Thurionen then pulled out a small vial of medicine, explaining that if mixed into food, it would forcibly expel any Trent that had already taken root inside Lloyd's body. Following his instructions, Kikyo brought tea over to Lloyd, but just as he was about to take a sip, Koba came storming over, shouting at Kikyo for slacking off on her duties again, telling Lloyd it was late and he should go get some rest instead of continuing to work. Once Lloyd had left, Koba grabbed the cup of tea and took a sip himself, only to immediately spit it out, since it tasted absolutely awful. Seeing this, Kikyo panicked and fled the scene to avoid being scolded further. The next morning, Riho also arrived at the hotel just as planned for her little vacation. She called for a masseuse to be sent up to her room, and somehow, unbelievably, that request ended up landing on Lloyd. Meanwhile, Selen had also come to the hotel accompanying her father. Coincidentally, she too found herself forced into a matchmaking arrangement. And to make matters worse, the man she was set to meet was none other than Alan. Selen had absolutely no interest in this whatsoever. Going through with a matchmaking meeting felt no different than outright betraying Lloyd, but her father insisted so firmly that she couldn't possibly refuse. What her father had no idea about, however, was that Selen had already quietly devised a plan. The moment that door opened and Alan stepped through it, she would kill him on the spot. True to her word, the instant the door cracked open even slightly, Selen leapt into action immediately. But upon realizing the person walking in was actually Lloyd, she instantly switched her attitude and pounced forward with delight. More overjoyed than a beloved puppy reunited with its owner after a long absence, Selen pulled Lloyd off to the side, telling their fathers that the young people's business had already been settled, so the adults could go ahead and discuss whatever they needed to on their own. Watching this unfold, both fathers were left utterly speechless. Selen didn't even bother wondering why Lloyd had suddenly shown up there in the first place, and had every intention of practically devouring him on the spot. Fortunately, Riho arrived just in time, grabbing her by the head and dragging her away, explaining that Alan, for some inexplicable reason, had collapsed unconscious inside the open-air bathhouse. In this difficult situation, Thurionen had asked Lloyd to step in and take his place in order to prevent things from spiraling further out of control. Hearing this, Selen immediately proposed that Lloyd pretend to go on a date with her, using the opportunity to lower the guard of whoever was secretly behind all this so they could investigate further. Riho, catching the unmistakable scent of Selen's real motive, being to romance Lloyd, remarked dryly that she was hardly fooling anyone with this so-called investigation excuse. Even so, Lloyd found the reasoning perfectly sound and agreed without hesitation. And so began a date that spiraled completely off the rails. Selen paid absolutely no attention whatsoever to the dangerous figure lurking in the shadows that actually needed to be exposed, and instead spent the entire time engineering situation after situation designed to get Lloyd to propose to her. The moment Lloyd finally uttered the exact words Selen had been hoping for, she immediately lunged forward to embrace him, determined to seal the deal right then and there so he'd have no way of backing out. At that precise moment, Riho appeared out of nowhere and smacked Selen across the head, thoroughly exhausted by this girl whose mind seemed capable of thinking about nothing but romance while completely ignoring the actual important mission at hand. Meanwhile, inside the hotel, tensions between the two nobles had grown considerably more strained. Koba suspected Thurionen of being the one illegally cultivating and trafficking Trent, while Thurionen, in turn, suspected Selen's own father. The whole situation had become hopelessly tangled, and their supposedly special investigation team still hadn't managed to accomplish anything meaningful whatsoever. Right at that moment, someone came riding in from a distance on a horse-drawn carriage. It was Shoma. He announced that the cargo in the back consisted of a massive quantity of firebombs, ordered under an incredibly tight deadline. Given the sheer quantity and the urgency involved, Shoma assumed the customer must have needed to burn down something enormous, and had upgraded the quality of the product accordingly just in case. Needless to say, the one who'd actually placed this order was none other than Selen herself. She'd originally planned to burn the entire hotel down just to avoid the matchmaking meeting altogether, only to change her mind the instant she realized it was Lloyd she'd be meeting instead. Watching Selen's face remain completely unbothered, as though nothing at all had happened, Riho's jaw twitched with the overwhelming urge to curse her out on the spot. Lloyd, seeing Shoma again, felt genuinely happy, but noticing his brother seemed rather busy, the two didn't linger long before parting ways. Selen, looking at the enormous pile of firebombs without a single flicker of concern, simply told Riho to handle it herself while she went off on her date. Correction. Her investigation into whoever was behind the string of mysterious unconsciousness cases. And so Selen proceeded to drag Lloyd from one place to another, sometimes gently, other times outright tying him up like some kind of criminal. Lloyd had absolutely no idea how to deal with this madwoman. While the two of them carried on with their so-called date, Kikyo, watching from a distance, genuinely didn't know what to say anymore. Poor Lloyd, already tangled up in this whole Trent mess, now had to deal with being latched onto by someone this unhinged as well. Truly, an unfortunate boy indeed. After waiting for quite some time, Kikyo finally found an opportunity to approach Lloyd alone. Using the excuse of teaching him proper massage technique, she began applying a special solution meant to purge any Trent from his body. But no matter how much she applied, nothing seemed to happen at all. Could it possibly be that the Trent had lodged itself somewhere within Lloyd's own flightless little bird, so to speak? Just as she was about to reach down toward that particular area, an icy chill suddenly swept through the air. Selen, watching from a distance, immediately flew into a rage and struck Kikyo with her strap. Kikyo lamented that things had been going so well, only to fall apart at the very last moment, as Selen had now wrapped herself around her, cutting off any chance of retreat. Kikyo tossed a towel to obscure Selen's vision, then twisted her body around and delivered an extremely precise, dangerous strike. However, thanks to the protection of the strap, Kikyo's attack had absolutely no effect whatsoever. Luckily for Kikyo, Selen suddenly found herself completely distracted by Lloyd's alluring physique, giving her just enough of an opening to slip away and escape. Selen's mind immediately shifted gears, and she cunningly lured Lloyd toward the bath, eager to get a full, unobstructed view of his entirely bare body. And so the two of them headed together toward the pool. But just before they could even jump in, Alka suddenly came flying in from the distance, intent on devouring Lloyd whole. Fortunately, Selen managed to intervene just in time to stop her, and right behind Alka came Marie, along with Mina and Philo as well. Exactly why Marie and Alka happened to be there needed no further explanation to anyone. As for Philo and Mina, their presence was somewhat different. The kingdom had actually hired them to investigate the mysterious happenings plaguing the hotel. After a fair bit of chaos and commotion, the whole group eventually went off to bathe together. Only a few, like Lloyd, remained focused on tracking down whoever was truly behind the mystery, while the rest of Selen's group kept squabbling amongst themselves over who would end up with Lloyd in the end. Overwhelmed with gratitude and wanting to ask Alka for help with the hotel's problem, Lloyd stood up abruptly, unwittingly revealing his impressively sizable, 30-centimeter endowment right in front of her. Philo reacted instantly, grabbing hold of Alka and flinging her far off into the distance. Philo had thrown Alka simply because she'd witnessed something she absolutely shouldn't have, and coincidentally, the direction she'd thrown her happened to be exactly where Kikyo was secretly spying on everyone. Kikyo had just barely whispered to herself, wondering if she'd finally been discovered, when a figure emerged from the shadows, the noble's attendant. Except his appearance now looked utterly bizarre, and the moment Kikyo laid eyes on him, she immediately recognized him as someone infected by Trent. Only now did she realize she'd been chasing entirely the wrong target this whole time. No sooner had she finished that thought than Kikyo discovered her own legs had been bound tightly in place, and the man before her had transformed entirely into a tree. While Kikyo stood there completely at a loss for what to do, Lloyd suddenly appeared, asking if Alka had happened to fly over this way. Looking at the transformed attendant, Lloyd didn't for a moment suspect he'd been infected by Trent. Instead, he assumed the man was simply cosplaying in order to please his master. Hearing this, the man completely lost his mind, his entire body expanding into a massive tree before he proceeded to transform other nearby trees into monsters as well. This man hadn't simply been infected. The very thing parasitizing him turned out to be none other than a seed of the Demon Lord himself. Despite how dire the situation had become, Lloyd remained entirely unbothered, punching through the swarm of monsters one after another without pause. Kikyo, caught off guard, couldn't react in time, and by the time she'd finally regained her composure, the transformed attendant had already made his way toward the hotel, intent on killing Thurionen, the arrogant noble who had always looked down on him with such disdain. Inside the hotel, right as Thurionen realized the person selling Trent was actually someone from within his own family, our king arrived, swinging his whip in an attempt to kill Thurionen on the spot. Though Selen's group managed to react in time, fearing that fighting here would damage the hotel, Philo delivered a powerful kick that sent our king sliding backward with considerable force. Even though she was quite strong herself, she could clearly tell she didn't have the strength to actually take this thing down. Mina, standing nearby, immediately cast an attack spell, but even a fierce pillar of flame like that failed to inflict any damage whatsoever. Magic simply had no effect on it at all. Riho, thinking quickly, suddenly remembered the pile of firebombs and told Selen to keep it occupied while she went to retrieve her little toys. But during the chaos of battle, several sections of the hotel had already begun collapsing from the sheer force of the fighting. Selen's father ended up pinned beneath a massive slab of concrete while trying to protect her, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't free him. Philo's side fared even worse, as both she and her sister had been captured and held tightly by our king. Right as they were about to be killed, Riho and Alan returned just in time, hurling firebombs directly at the creature and freeing both sisters from its grip. Seizing the opportunity, Mina summoned a massive pillar of water to trap the Demon Lord our king, and Riho followed up with an ice spell, using the water already surrounding it to freeze its body solid. Everyone assumed that would be enough to finish it off, but our king was still very much alive and actively searching for a way to break free. Just as everyone stood there, unsure what to do next, Lloyd finally made it back in time. He rescued Selen and her father first, then, following Marie's instructions, charged forward and crushed the very core of the Demon Lord our king with his bare hands. And with that, the whole ordeal finally came to an end. Amid everyone's overwhelming relief and joy, Lloyd quietly reassured himself that he'd finally managed to kill a monster, surely just an ordinary one at that. The following morning, with Alka's assistance, the hotel wasn't just rebuilt but renovated to look even more impressive than before. Koba and Thurionen also managed to clear up their earlier misunderstanding, with Koba genuinely looking forward to welcoming this difficult noble back again someday, while Thurionen decided to leave Kikyo behind, free for Koba to work to the bone as he pleased. No sooner had Lloyd cleaned up this mess than yet another one popped up. For reasons unclear, Makona had gone to meet with a mysterious man and Shoma. She wanted power, enough to kill her enemy and reclaim the person she loved, and that enemy of hers was none other than Lloyd himself. Back at Marie's house, she'd just woken up and, in the mood to be pampered, wanted Lloyd to feed her a bite of breakfast. when Selen suddenly showed up instead. Marie sighed, reflecting that she really needed to stay on guard around this witch. Drop your guard for even a second, and you'd lose your husband just like that. As it turned out, they just received a direct order from the king to hunt down a giant serpent, and so the whole group had to rush straight to the royal palace to meet with him. While they waited, everyone was tense with nerves, only for the king to show up looking so absurdly ridiculous that, had no one told them, everyone would have assumed some delinquent teenager was pulling a prank disguised as royalty. Chrome grabbed the king by the collar and asked if he wanted a punch in the face for joking around like this, and the king immediately snapped back to a serious demeanor. After that, Colleen briefed everyone on the plan to deal with the giant serpent, and the group set off into the dungeon. While everyone was busy with the mission, Alka had also dropped her usual playful demeanor, moving with unusual seriousness as though searching for someone. In the end, she came back and dragged Marie along to lead the way into the dungeon. A little later, once they'd made it into the dungeon, Lloyd remained entirely focused on hunting down the giant serpent, completely oblivious to the fact that the three young women trailing behind him were on the verge of a full-blown confrontation. Selen and Philo had teamed up to interrogate Riho, demanding to know once and for all whether she actually had feelings for Lloyd, whether she had intentions toward him. Everyone here was, after all, a rival vying for the same man, and while everyone else's intentions were painfully obvious, Riho remained the sole unknown variable. Neither of them was willing to tolerate this uncertainty any longer and pressed her with dead serious intensity. Right at that moment, a loud crash echoed through the dungeon. Riho, assuming Lloyd was already locked in battle with the giant serpent, charged forward without another word. She had no idea it was actually Alka, having barreled straight through a wall from outside. Having made it this far, Alka no longer needed Marie to guide her and simply punched through walls herself, forcing her way deeper into the dungeon. Left behind, Marie was searching for a way out when she ran into a trent tree, and right at the very center of its trunk was Makona, her power having mysteriously transformed. The moment she spotted Marie, Makona couldn't hide her overwhelming joy and happiness. Under Marie's questioning, Makona didn't hesitate to explain exactly why she'd taken on this new form. It was all for revenge against Lloyd, the man who'd stolen away the person she loved. Marie, ordinarily sharp-witted, suddenly turned remarkably dense in this particular instance. She had no idea Makona actually loved her, and instead assumed Lloyd must have some perverse taste for being taken advantage of, concluding that stealing away Makona's boyfriend had led to the current situation. The moment that thought crossed her mind, Makona's branches shot out and bound her tightly, using her as leverage to draw Lloyd out. Lloyd, arriving right at that moment, took in the whole scene and demanded Makona release Marie first, insisting that no matter what was going on between them, an innocent bystander had no business being dragged into this. Naturally, Makona had no intention of letting Lloyd have his way. Not only did she refuse to let Marie go, she continued using her as a hostage to threaten him. And so the two of them clashed head-on. Despite having gained the power of both our king and Abaddon, Makona still couldn't gain the upper hand, getting knocked back by a single punch from Lloyd. She used magic to accelerate herself forward and delivered a kick that sent Lloyd flying. And before he could even react, Makona grabbed his head and dragged him across a considerable distance. But none of that amounted to much against Lloyd. He simply caught her arm and slammed her straight into the ground. While the two of them continued fighting, Selen's group made their way inside. Makona immediately swung a branch toward them, and Lloyd, wanting to protect everyone, threw himself forward to block the blow. Seeing this, Makona let out a soft chuckle, remarking that without these people around, Lloyd wouldn't have been injured in the first place. Lloyd, however, didn't see it that way at all. Without his comrades, he wouldn't have been able to accomplish anything meaningful to begin with, and so he held no resentment toward them whatsoever. With that said, both sides threw themselves back into an even more ferocious exchange of attacks than before. The sheer force of their collision sent violent tremors rippling through the entire cavern, cracking the ground open and causing everyone to fall down to a lower level. Lloyd and Makona continued their battle, clashing from the air all the way down to the ground. She twisted her branches together into a massive drill and struck directly at Lloyd. And though he took the hit head-on, he didn't so much as stagger. Instead, he grabbed hold of the branch and spun it around, generating a powerful whirlwind. Once he'd built up enough force, Lloyd hurled Makona straight up through the cavern, sending her crashing through layer after layer of rock before she shot up into the sky and vanished without a trace. The moment the fight ended, an enormous serpent appeared, though it carried no malicious intent whatsoever, and even praised Lloyd for fighting so well. The creature introduced itself as the sacred beast responsible for guarding Conran's barrier, explaining that it had met Lloyd when he was still quite small, so it was only natural he wouldn't remember. Lloyd asked why Viratora happened to be here of all places, and the moment he did, the old serpent lost all sense of dignity and burst out in frustration, insisting it was entirely that old hag Alka's fault. She'd apparently joked about wanting to skin Viratora and turn him into an apron, only for that joke to become genuinely real, forcing him to venture out into the outside world just to recover from the ordeal. The instant he'd finished venting, a mysterious man stepped out from the shadows. He asked Lloyd how he appeared to him, and in Lloyd's eyes, this man radiated an unmistakably sinister energy. At that very moment, Alka came charging up from below, shouting that she'd finally found him, Sue, the very mysterious man standing right in front of them. Seeing Alka there without so much as a single word of apology directed his way, Viratora once again flew into a fit of outrage. Taking advantage of his distraction, Sue lunged forward and plunged his hand deep into the creature's back, ripping out its core. Alka was utterly horrified watching this unfold. Viratora was the very embodiment of Conran's protective barrier and the foundation of her own power as well. If he died, everything would essentially be over, and that, of course, was exactly Sue's intention all along. The moment Viratora's magic core was crushed, he vanished entirely. Furious, Alka lunged forward and delivered a powerful kick straight to Sue's face. Sue seemed genuinely puzzled as to how Alka could still be this strong, but choosing to prioritize safety, he decided to retreat regardless. Alka then noticed Selen's strap, realizing that Viratora's consciousness had unexpectedly taken up residence within it. She recalled the whole apron incident, explaining that due to a few careless mistakes, she'd accidentally created the strap in the process, and since it hadn't turned out usable, she'd simply sold it off. Hearing this, Viratora nearly choked on his own rage and gave Alka a proper beating right then and there. But the most pressing matter now was getting out of there, since the dungeon was on the verge of collapsing entirely. Outside, Alan, hearing the tremendous commotion from within, grew anxious and rushed inside, fully prepared to die if it meant Lloyd was in trouble. It was precisely this heroic act that earned Alan the admiration of every soldier in the army. When he returned to report to the king, despite having done absolutely nothing of substance, he ended up receiving the most generous reward of anyone, even earning the title of Dragon Slayer. Alan stood frozen in disbelief, wondering if this was truly what the legends meant by reaping rewards without lifting a finger. Coming up soon, the Empire had sent a letter requesting a friendly exchange match to demonstrate the goodwill between the two nations. The moment the king read this news, he didn't hesitate for a second in appointing the hero Alan to represent them in battle. Meanwhile, Lloyd's group headed back to the village of Conran to find a way to save Viratora, since leaving him trapped in the form of a strap indefinitely simply wasn't acceptable. Selen's group tagged along as well. Riho was hoping to strike it rich and turn her fortunes around. Selen had nothing on her mind except meeting her future in-laws, and Philo, being the martial arts fanatic she was, saw this as nothing short of paradise, a place brimming with powerful fighters like Lloyd to exchange skills with. Marie, standing beside them, had to shout to snap everyone back to their senses and remind them of the actual purpose of the trip. On top of that, Chrome and Colleen joined them as well, with Marie unsure whether that was really a good idea. Colleen confidently assured her it would be fine, since Mina was staying behind to handle the exchange match preparations, though poor Alan ended up being the unfortunate sacrifice, dragged along against his will like a pig being hauled off, utterly powerless to resist. A little later, everyone arrived at a cave containing a massive door. At Alka's call, a boy who appeared to be a mere child stepped out from within. Looks, however, could be deceiving. Despite his childlike appearance, this person named Huge was, in terms of actual age, in no way inferior to Alka, essentially an elderly man trapped inside a child's body. After finishing his little joke, Huge immediately scolded Viratora for wandering outside carelessly like that, then turned to scold Alka as well, calling her the embodiment of every crime imaginable, the most foolish being on the entire planet. Alka, refusing to back down from the insult, shot back that the very idea of making an apron as a gift for Lloyd had come from Huge himself in the first place. Sensing where this conversation was inevitably headed, Huge quickly urged everyone to head into the village instead. Standing before the peaceful, rural scenery of the village, everyone was a little taken aback. They'd assumed Kunran would be some grand, radiant place befitting the legends surrounding it, only to find it looked no different on the surface than any other ordinary village. That said, the air here genuinely felt noticeably fresher and cleaner than anywhere else they'd been. The moment they stepped into the village, everyone's jaws dropped in sheer disbelief at what they were witnessing. There was a child, likely not even 10 years old yet, leaping up to a rooftop and diving down like a bird, and remarkably, both his mother and father were doing the exact same thing without a second thought. Before they could even recover from that shock, another one arrived immediately after. An arrow came flying in from a distance. A woman read the message written on it, wrote her reply, then flung it toward a distant mountain with an unbelievably casual toss, one that hit with the force of a cannon blast, shaking the entire mountain on impact. Lloyd explained that since this place was fairly behind the times, this was simply how people communicated with ease. Right after that, an older man climbed inside a cannon, asking the same woman to channel magical power into it to fire him off. The moment she did, the man shot straight up toward the mountain like an actual cannonball. Faced with everyone's utterly baffled expressions, Lloyd explained that this was simply how villagers traveled whenever they had urgent business to attend to. The whole group couldn't help but wonder whether the man had, in fact, just gone straight up to heaven to reunite with God himself. Right at that moment, an elderly man approached from the distance. It was none other than Lloyd's grandfather, and the instant Philo laid eyes on him, she immediately stepped forward without hesitation to ask for his guidance. The old man, watching her demonstrate her technique, recognized it right away as the very martial art he himself had founded, one that Philo had apparently taught herself entirely on her own. To avoid disrupting their moment, Riho volunteered herself to carry the massive fish they'd brought along, allowing the two of them to fully enjoy their martial arts exchange in peace. By the time they finally made it back home, Riho felt like she'd lost half her life force. Whatever kind of fish that was, it was unbelievably heavy, and had Riho not had remarkable endurance, she surely would have been crushed flat beneath it. Right around then, Colleen and Chrome asked Alka about Murthohan's current whereabouts. As it turned out, Murthohan hadn't died following the whole Abaddon incident. Instead, Alka had brought him back to Kunran to work in the fields, cultivating rice and stockpiling food reserves for any unforeseen circumstances that might arise in the future. His life here, surprisingly, wasn't bad at all. Quite the opposite, in fact, spending each day here filled with genuine joy and free of worry. The only thing Murthohan lacked here was fertilizer, and so he asked Colleen if she could relieve herself right there to help supplement the soil. Hearing this, Colleen could barely contain her fury. She'd traveled all this way just to visit him, and all he cared about was getting her to defecate for fertilizer. After a bit of joking around, the two of them finally got down to the actual matter at hand. When exactly Murthohan intended to return, he said he had no plans to, explaining that even though he'd been under the demon's control at the time, his intention to overthrow the kingdom remained something entirely unforgivable regardless. Meanwhile, on Selen's side, she was busy showing everyone her marriage registration papers when a loud, thunderous crash suddenly echoed from outside. Hearing that Alka was chasing off some kind of flying lizard, Riho volunteered to handle it herself, only to discover, to her horror, that it was actually a fire dragon. Without a word, Riho immediately turned and fled for dear life, while the village children, using nothing more than paper airplanes, effortlessly severed the dragon's horn and sent the terrified beast fleeing in retreat. Riho was utterly shocked witnessing this, and just as Selen moved to comfort her, she suddenly realized those paper airplanes had actually been made from her own marriage registration papers, sending both of them into a shared state of complete emotional collapse. That evening, everyone gathered around the dinner table to enjoy a meal together. Philo, still buzzing with excitement from the morning's earlier battle, was immediately deflated upon learning those had merely been the most basic beginner-level strikes taught by Lloyd's grandfather. On top of that, the dinner table was laden with all sorts of terrifying monsters that would be nearly impossible to find served anywhere else. The meal went along fairly smoothly, with Riho being remarkably resourceful and consistently proactive in handling every task at hand, earning high praise from one family member who went so far as to advise Lloyd to choose her as his future wife. Meanwhile, his grandfather took quite a liking to Philo instead, a martial artist whose unwavering discipline and resilience he clearly admired. Selen, unfortunately, received no such endorsement from anyone, leaving her thoroughly frustrated by the whole ordeal. Everyone assumed this was simply an ordinary night of returning home to the village, except for Alka and Huge, who remained deeply concerned about the coming upheavals in the wider world. Su appeared to be attempting to resurrect the various demon lords, though what worried Alka far more than that particular threat was the possibility that Viratora, once fully recovered, might remember things far better left forgotten. Just how chaotic things might become at that point remained an unsettling question mark. And so, for the time being, she still hadn't begun any treatment to restore him. On top of all that, Marie had also gone to speak with Murthohan about how he'd been manipulated by Abaddon in the first place. Murthohan recounted having met a mysterious man who'd asked him how he appeared, before handing him a strange egg. From that moment on, Murthohan, as though losing all sense of reason, had brought it straight to the king without a single thought crossing his mind. His account immediately reminded Marie of Su. Meanwhile, on Riho's side, the villagers had gifted her a set of pajamas. At first, she hadn't paid it much attention, but Selen and Philo kept eyeing her suspiciously, convinced she'd secretly gone off to make a move on Lloyd's family member all on her own. What's more, judging by the quality of the fabric alone, it was clearly high-end merchandise, and the moment Riho realized this, she immediately stripped it off, intent on bringing it back to the city to sell, not even bothering to keep the underwear for herself. Coincidentally, right at that exact moment, Lloyd happened to walk in. Philo reacted instantly, hurling him straight back out without a second thought. As for Riho, she spent that entire night bound so tightly she couldn't move even a single inch. Barely into the early morning, Alka had already been woken up, and she couldn't help but grumble irritably about it. Hearing this, Viratora immediately grew furious. Today was supposed to be the day everyone worked together to figure out how to restore his body. Alka was always the type to cause devastating consequences and then act as though she were completely innocent, conveniently forgetting everything that happened. And Viratora genuinely felt like losing his mind over her attitude. If it weren't for the simple fact that he couldn't actually beat Alka in a fight, Viratora would have gladly sought revenge, centuries of friendship between them notwithstanding. But the priority right now was restoring his body. If he continued existing in this state indefinitely, there was no telling when he might simply vanish for good, so Viratora decided not to dwell on it further. A little while later, everyone made their way to a location quite far from the village. An imposing fortress of considerable size. At first glance, it resembled some kind of residential structure. But this was actually the prison of finality. Those unfamiliar with the place, Riho in particular, were practically buzzing with anticipation the moment they saw it, imagining all sorts of valuable treasures potentially hidden within. Treasures she could sell for a fortune once she got back to the city. Alka quickly explained otherwise. If anyone actually stepped inside, they'd likely drop dead on the spot before they even had a chance to gasp. The prison of finality was the place where the various demon lords had been sealed away, built upon the very foundation of Viratora's power, which also happened to be the source of Alka's own strength, making her essentially unmatched by any opponent. The connecting thread binding the prison of finality to Alka was Viratora himself. If he ceased to exist, Alka would lose every ounce of her power along with him. This was precisely why Viratora's continued existence mattered so profoundly. Having heard the explanation, Marie found herself utterly speechless. She genuinely couldn't tell whether her master was pretending to be foolish or was simply that foolish in truth. How could anyone possibly be careless enough to skin Viratora alive just to make an apron out of him? Alka immediately deflected, insisting Huge was the one who'd egged her on into doing something so reckless. Wanting to avoid getting scolded further, Huge quickly dropped the subject and summoned a full set of cooking utensils instead. In a manner no one could have possibly anticipated, Huge wrapped Viratora up like a piece of meat, then proceeded to season him with spices as though preparing an ordinary meal. Once everything was ready, Huge placed Viratora into a pot, essentially stewing him like a cut of meat. A little later, he pulled an orb from the pot, and that, apparently, was that. Now they just needed to wait. To prove his method had worked, Huge flicked Alka's forehead, causing her considerable pain. It had been quite a long time since Alka had actually felt physical pain like that. With Viratora temporarily gone, Alka was now essentially no different from an ordinary 9-year-old child, save for the fact that she still possessed the mind of someone far older. With that settled, Huge suddenly brought up the upcoming friendly exchange match between the Empire and the Kingdom. Lloyd had already promised he'd be back in time to watch Ellen compete, and so he hurried back toward the village to say goodbye to everyone. Huge, at that moment, pulled Alka aside. She initially assumed something important needed discussing, only to find herself lured straight into a hidden pit instead. Alka initially thought Huge was simply getting even with her, but that wasn't it at all. Huge genuinely intended to trap her there. Everything Sue and Shoma were currently plotting had, in fact, been carried out with Huge's assistance the whole time. For reasons unclear, he wanted to unleash the sealed demon lords in order to reshape the world entirely. Having successfully trapped Alka, Huge made his way to the teleportation gate, telling everyone to go on ahead, promising he'd summon Lloyd shortly afterward. Yet when Lloyd finally arrived, Huge instead told him to go find the village chief, warning that she was currently in a weakened state and needed to be handled carefully. The moment they made it back to Izami, Huge immediately sealed the teleportation gate shut. Murthohan's sudden appearance caught Huge off guard, genuinely startling him. Had anyone else from the village followed along, everything would have fallen apart instantly. Fortunately, Murthohan had come alone, simply intending to bring everyone some local specialties as gifts. With the teleportation gate now closed, he found himself temporarily unable to return to Kunran to continue his diligent farming work, and so he had no choice but to head to the kingdom instead. The moment they got back, Riho immediately went off to sell her goods and made off with a considerable sum of money. This trip had genuinely turned out to be an unqualified success as far as Riho was concerned, with nothing to complain about whatsoever. Running into Mina right around then, the two decided to go pay Roll a visit together. Though Roll had regained consciousness and was no longer being manipulated by her obsession with the Holy Sword, her actual personality still remained nowhere to be found. She was currently busy writing a guidebook on career advancement, tailored specifically for people with limited natural talent but boundless, ruthless ambition like herself. Riho and Mina listened to this and found themselves utterly speechless. Thanks to their recent trip, Riho asked Roll who exactly had told her about the Holy Sword in the first place. Based on Roll's description of the person's appearance, tone of voice, and characteristic manner of speaking, it sounded remarkably similar to Sue. What's more, Roll also recalled that someone unusually distinctive had been traveling alongside Sue, a child whose mouth kept making constant crunching sounds, as though continuously biting down on hard candy. From this description, the child sounded suspiciously similar to Huge. Hearing all this, Riho decided to stay cautious just in case, though for the time being, there was no way to confirm or even guess whether the person in question was genuinely connected to Sue at all. Little did she expect that when she headed to the competition grounds to check things out, she'd actually run into both Sue and Shoma there in person. The moment Riho noticed something was off, she immediately reported it to the king, who initially wasn't sure whether to believe her. It was only upon learning that Riho was a friend of Marie's that he stopped worrying about the matter entirely, instead pulling her aside to ask about his daughter's well-being first and foremost. Meanwhile, on Lloyd's end, he'd managed to find Alka, since this particular spot happened to be the exact location where he'd once fallen as a child and couldn't climb back up. Fortunately, Alka had led everyone there to find him back then. It was in that very moment that Lloyd resolved to become genuinely strong enough to bring others the same sense of security and reassurance he'd once received from the villagers. Hearing this, Alka's heart warmed considerably, and she rose to her feet, resolved not to let Huge have his way. She would put a stop to his dark scheme no matter the cost. Even with the teleportation gate sealed shut, Alka remained completely unworried. The people of Kunran always had a reliable method of travel for emergencies just like this, climbing directly into a cannon's barrel and launching themselves through the sky like a bullet. Combined with Lloyd's ability to accelerate himself, there was simply no way they wouldn't make it back to Izami in time. By the next morning, the friendly exchange match had finally begun. Alan, wielding his axe, charged forward on the battlefield and brought it down in a decisive strike, but the only thing he'd actually cut through was a scrap of black fabric, as his opponent had already leapt into the air to dodge entirely. And that opponent, as it turned out, was none other than Makona herself. The moment she turned around, Alan was struck by a blow that sent him crashing into the wall, though he quickly recovered his stance and swung his axe once more as Makona charged in again. She, however, swiftly maneuvered around behind him and landed another kick. Watching this scene unfold, Sue remarked to the king that the Empire had developed a weapon far more powerful than any monster, one that remained utterly loyal throughout the entire battle. If the kingdom and the Empire simply joined forces, one contributing advanced technology, the other abundant resources, the two combined would undoubtedly become the dominant power of the entire world. Colleen and Chrome, standing nearby, wanted to speak up and intervene, but Shoma stepped in and immobilized them completely. Under the sheer weight of his pressure, neither of them could move even the slightest bit. Yet the king, without a moment's hesitation, flatly refused the proposal. When he'd been possessed by Abaddon before, he'd caused tremendous suffering to his own people, and even his own children. Now, regardless of who stood before him, he had no intention whatsoever of allowing himself to be forced into that same nightmare ever again. The instant the king finished speaking, Huge hurled out a series of strange orbs, from which countless grasshopper-like monsters emerged, wreaking havoc across the entire arena. Yet, to everyone's surprise, Chrome immediately shouted for everyone to prepare for battle, and the audience members watching the match, seemingly out of nowhere, pulled out swords and spears, standing up and cutting down monsters without a single missed strike. Shoma and Sue were both utterly stunned, never suspecting for a moment that the entire audience consisted entirely of soldiers and skilled adventurers in disguise. Just as the two of them prepared to confront the king's group, Murthohan suddenly appeared, performing an absurdly stylish spin with his farming tools before transforming, leaving him wearing nothing but a loincloth around his waist. Colleen and Chrome, finding the sight utterly ridiculous, couldn't help but voice their complaints. Murthohan, however, paid them no mind whatsoever, gripping his scythe tightly and charging straight at Shoma. As Shoma retreated further into the arena, Murthohan grew increasingly aggressive with his attacks. After observing him for a moment, Shoma remarked, almost impressed, that the two weapons Murthohan wielded were, in fact, divine artifacts. Even so, that hardly mattered. The gap between the people of Qumran and the rest of the outside world remained an insurmountable divide, and with a single strike, Shoma sent Murthohan flying without much effort at all. Shoma then revealed to everyone present that he hadn't left the village of Qumran simply because he found it boring. His desire to change the world stemmed from a similar sentiment entirely. Shoma wanted to create a world thrown into chaos, purely so that Lloyd could finally realize his dream of becoming a hero. Sue's motivations were much the same. Sue was, in truth, a being created by Alka using ancient runes, born from an era when the world had been engulfed in chaos, a time when humanity desperately needed a leader to guide them. Once every threat to humanity had been eliminated, Sue should have ceased to exist. Yet he had continued on regardless. Sue's ultimate goal was simply to disappear from this world entirely, and in order to achieve that, he needed to create a new hero for this world to rely on. This was precisely why Sue and Shoma had decided to join forces. Amid all this chaos unfolding, Makona had also set her sights on Marie, though rather than attacking her outright, she simply kept circling nearby, drawing closer. Seeing this, Philo showed no mercy whatsoever and delivered a swift kick in response. Right at that moment, a thunderous crash suddenly erupted in the middle of the arena. It was Lloyd, finally arriving on the scene, and taking in the chaotic sight before him. He had no idea a massive battle was even taking place, since as far as he was concerned, these monsters were nothing more than slightly oversized insects to him. As for Huge, since Alka hadn't revealed the whole truth, Lloyd ended up scolding him for failing to accomplish his task and running away instead, on top of sealing the teleportation gate shut. What a nasty thing to do. All Lloyd actually wanted to do with Huge was smash the egg-holding Viratora captive. Naturally, Huge had no intention of allowing that and had already prepared for exactly this scenario. Huge flung out the piece of candy he'd been chewing on, and an enormous magic circle materialized in the sky above, summoning forth a golem. Not only that, but the golem also absorbed the unconscious Makona lying nearby, fusing her directly into itself. It then turned and threw a punch straight at Lloyd, though as far as he was concerned, this creature's strength was hardly anything worth mentioning. Lloyd not only blocked the attack with ease, he proceeded to smash apart every single part of the golem's body. Yet the creature possessed an incredibly powerful regenerative ability. No matter which part was destroyed, it could restore itself at an almost unbelievable speed. Even severing its limbs entirely proved insufficient to permanently destroy the golem. Everyone watching from outside understood exactly what was happening. It was drawing on Makona's power to heal itself continuously. Since Lloyd couldn't bring himself to attack her directly, he found himself gradually losing ground in the fight. Lloyd grew genuinely disappointed in himself, frustrated that he couldn't even manage to defeat a single monster. Even so, no matter how hard the golem struck, it barely managed to injure Lloyd at all, at most drawing a small trickle of blood despite its mountain-crushing punches and kicks. Watching this unfold, Murthohan charged forward to join the fight. shouting at Lloyd to remember exactly what his dream had been all along. Lloyd had wanted to become a soldier in order to protect the people he cared about. And so, rather than continuing to simply endure the blows, Lloyd rose back to his feet. Meanwhile, on the other side, Riho shouted at Makona, promising that if she managed to break free from the golem, she'd hand over Marie's underwear as a reward. Faster than anyone could blink, Makona instantly regained her senses and tore herself free from the golem in a split second. Selen, seizing the opportunity while Huge's attention was elsewhere, snatched the egg away and freed Viratora from his confinement. Lloyd, meanwhile, grabbed the golem and hurled it up into the sky, unleashing a magical strike that completely pulverized its body, leaving not even the smallest fragment of rubble behind. Right at that moment, another enormous magic circle appeared in the sky above, and from within it, massive boulders came crashing down, crushing the swarm of insect monsters below. The one responsible for this was none other than Alka herself. Realizing he'd already lost, Huge admitted that his true intention had genuinely been to change the world for the better, wanting to use the prison of finality to serve and benefit humanity. Unlike Sue and Shoma, who, upon seeing Lloyd arrive, hadn't even bothered fighting and instead spent the whole time obsessively filming everything on camera. But with Alka having fully restored her powers and returned to the fight, continuing this confrontation was no longer a wise course of action, and so all three of them decided to retreat together. And just like that, an incident that had come dangerously close to plunging the entire world into chaos under the control of resurrected demon lords was resolved neatly and cleanly. As for Lloyd, the very person who had been both the cause and the solution to this entire ordeal, he remained completely oblivious to the sheer magnitude of what had just occurred, simply dismissing it all as a minor, insignificant matter not even worth mentioning. Truly, the folly of youth that had yet to experience the world.